the IUCN Environmental Law Centre to present a pre-colloquium workshop, and we're very delighted to have a range of excellent speakers and excellent topics. Melissa Powers, who is the co-chair of the Academy's teaching committee, will explain a little bit more about the ideas behind today's workshop in a short while. It's just my pleasure to firstly welcome everyone and thank the speakers who've agreed to contribute to today's proceedings. And I think, Melissa, there is the idea of publishing these the papers in due course after the event. I was thinking about it this week. For those of you, many of you are of course here for the rest of the week, and in a way this is the appetiser. Tomorrow we have the entree with the legal clinic workshop, and the main course is coming for about 3 or 4 days next week, and I think we're finishing off with dessert in the form of a field trip and another event at the World Bank. So you need to measure your intake. We've got a lot to listen to and to think about over the course of the next 5 or 6 days, and I think it's a very exciting program. I just want to thank, firstly, the Environmental Law Commission and Alejandro for the Environmental Law Centre, I should say, and Alejandro as its director, for their support for the Academy generally, and particularly for the pre-colloquium workshop, and Louisa, who's been helping, I know, to organise this as well. We really appreciate the opportunity to collaborate around this sort of event and value that relationship. Also to thank the University of Maryland through its law school and all the wonderful student helpers out there and the people who are behind organising this event. We've got superb facilities here. It's sort of it's a source of great envy to walk into a law school of this kind and just see the resources that are available, and we're very pleased to have that relationship as well. And of course finally to thank Melissa and the committee. So I think that's enough by way of introductions, and Alejandro, I think you're going to just also say a few words before Melissa takes over. Thank you.
Thank you, Rob. And as Rob said, you will be hearing a lot of people during this day, so I think you don't need to listen to me or a long speech this morning. My name is Alejandro Isa. As Rob said, I'm the director of the IUCN Environmental Law Centre, and I'm very pleased to be here with you. And just a word of thanks, especially to the research committee of the Academy, who has put together this workshop now for the third time. No? This is the third one that we've been organizing, and I'm very proud of this collaboration with the Academy in different forms, but especially, you know, in organizing this pre-colloquium workshop that is very concentrated, that is a space and offers a very nice and concentrated space for discussion on a particular topic. In this case, ecosystems, goods and services, and the relationship with various aspects of legislation, policy, and so on. Also, I would like to thank, you know, the Academy Secretariat, Winnie, and all the colleagues in Ottawa that have done a magnificent work in providing a lot of support for this to happen, also on the University of Maryland for opening this space for organizing the third workshop. My colleague Luisa Denier, who is here with us today, will give you some further information, I understand, at the end of the workshop on how this fits into the bigger picture on the IUCN Environmental Law Program, and in particular with the activities that are going to take place towards the end of the year in the World Conservation Congress of IUCN in Jeju in Korea. Thanks, Melissa, especially. Thanks, Wilhelmine, on behalf of the Law Center, and thank you all for being here with us.
Hi, I'm Melissa Powers. I'm an associate professor of law at Lewis and Clark Law School. And although most of you probably have a good understanding of ecosystem services, in the event some people are not familiar with the concept, I'm just going to provide a very brief introduction and then highlight some of the questions that arise as we move towards more use of an ecosystem services model, either to establish economic value for the services that ecosystems provide, or to provide payments for those who are providing ecosystem services and protecting habitats. And there are a lot of questions that come up about how you value ecosystem services, how you ensure equity, and how perhaps you maintain the moral impetus to protect the environment absent the economic benefits that it derives. So those are the questions we're going to be exploring today. So what are ecosystem services? There are a lot of different definitions, but in essence, what an ecosystem service is it's a benefit that the environment or a protected or intact habitat provides. So when we're thinking about ecosystem services, one of the good examples of ecosystem services can be developed through a wetlands model, understanding what ecosystem services wetlands provide. So when we're thinking about wetlands and we start thinking about why do we protect wetlands, ignoring the inherent environmental value you might find in wetlands, you can start to think about all of the different benefits that maintaining wetlands provides. So for example, habitat. Wetlands are a key source of habitat for a number of fish species, wildlife species, plant species. And then you take the ecosystem services model and extend it beyond just the fact that they provide habitat and start to think about what benefits does this habitat actually itself provide. So if we think about, for example, wildlife and birds, we might think about, I'm not sure what's happened here, sorry about that. We might think about keeping our slides in the right picture. When we think about wildlife and birds, you might start to think about, well, people travel to wetlands to observe birds, which means that they are actually investing in the tourism economy, or they're going there to take photos. So we might also then translate habitat value not just into tourism dollars, but then also into sales related to photography. Or people travel to wetlands to engage in hunting. So we have another source of economic value that habitat protection might provide. Wetlands provide another ecosystem service in terms of providing flood control. Where you have a wetland habitat adjacent, for example, to a stream, you provide an ability for the stream to increase its water level, moving beyond the natural banks of a stream. And then once the water level subsides, the water from the wetland will filter back into the natural stream system in a much more moderate way than if you don't have wetlands adjacent to a stream. Where you don't have wetlands adjacent to a stream, you can have flooding. And so we can think about ecosystem services on an economic level in terms of providing flood protection and avoiding incidents like this. So when we start to figure out the economic benefits of flood control, we would think about, well, what is the property damage that wetlands protection provides? What is the human life protection that wetlands protection provides? And so we can look at this concept of flood control and then look at the consequences of avoiding flooding and turn that into an economic concept. Same is true of storm surge control. So several years ago in the US, Hurricane Katrina devastated New Orleans, and part of the reason that it devastated New Orleans is because the wetlands in the Gulf of Mexico had been developed or dredged or otherwise damaged. If you have these wetlands intact, and especially if we're thinking about mangrove-based wetlands where you have deep root systems, this is a mangrove tree, you have the ability to provide even greater protection against storm surges. And the economic and human life consequences of not protecting against storm surges can be intense. And so we can monetize on a great level the benefits that wetlands provide. Another example are pollution filters. Wetlands, especially when we think about wetlands that are adjacent to agricultural lands, can filter out sediments, they can filter out other types of pesticides, fertilizers, and other chemicals that would otherwise go into stream systems and perhaps into drinking water. And we can also think about wetlands as actually maintaining availability of water. Wetlands provide a source of groundwater recharge so that areas adjacent to protected wetlands can tap into underground aquifers even during drought seasons or drier periods, because the wetlands themselves are continuing to recharge these underground water systems. All of these have very practical value that we can seek to monetize, and that's in part what ecosystem services try to do. So how do ecosystem services try to protect these different functions? So first of all, the concept of ecosystem services is actually about recognizing the functions that ecosystems provide and categorizing them. So I just did that with our flood protection, our storm surges. And as you'll notice, though, I'm translating a lot of these values into human uses of intact ecosystem services. By doing that, we might be able then to provide some type of evaluation. So now we can start to figure out not just what the benefits that an ecosystem might provide, but how much is it worth to us? And how long is it going to maintain that value? You can use ecosystem services in cost-benefit analyses. So where environmental laws and environmental protections require, for example, agencies to provide an estimate of the costs and benefits of regulatory action, integrating ecosystem services model into the benefit side can avoid having environmentally destructive activities not internalize the costs of their behaviors. And so by internalizing the costs, we can avoid, ideally, some of the externalities that environmental law has not yet captured. Ecosystem services can also turn into a payment model for environmental protection. We learned a little bit about this for people who were in South Africa last year, but the concept is that those who are protecting habitats should have an economic incentive and economic reward for doing so. Ecosystem services provides a tool for valuating and then paying those who are actually engaged in the protection. And then finally, ecosystem services can translate into ecosystem services markets. So this goes back in part to the idea of internalizing the costs of the harm that an actor is causing, and perhaps saying that, well, you can proceed with this activity, but in exchange for this, you're going to have to pay for the ecosystem services protection over here. And maybe if we have intact wetlands in one place, you can damage a wetland in another place in exchange for funding or buying habitat necessary to restore some other wetland. So there's an expansive potential for the use of ecosystem services as a way to effectively internalize the costs and understand what the economic consequences of habitat destruction are. But there are some limits to ecosystem services and questions around the ecosystem services doctrine. So first of all, just on an ethical or moral issue, what about those ecosystems that don't clearly provide a whole lot of value? What if their primary value is saving some little fish that has no commercial value, that has no clear research value, that's just a fish? Should we protect those at the same level if they don't have the same economic value? How do we value ecosystem services? And when we're thinking about valuation and the cost-benefit analyses, for example, if you look at the protection that an existing ecosystem service might provide well into the future, well, as you move into the future, you need to apply a discount rate to make sure that you're not overcompensating somebody now for the value that will presumably increase over time in the future. What is the value of certain benefits that habitats provide? What's the value of that fish that I was talking about? Or what's the value of human life if we're thinking about flood and storm surge control? And how far should this valuation extend? At what point are we being too speculative in terms of protecting ecosystem services? Payments for ecosystem services can raise some really interesting property rights questions as well. Who owns the services? If you received a conveyance of land at the time that ecosystem services weren't recognized, did you also receive those ecosystem services? This is coming up in the concept of carbon rights, for example, where some people are suggesting that carbon rights should be a severable estate from the property itself. But of course, you can't sever carbon rights without affecting the use of the property. So these are questions that are going to continue to rise. And then, how do you even create an ecosystem market? How do you use it? What are the risks and benefits of having ecosystem services and ecosystem service markets? These are all the questions that we're going to be exploring today through a number of different panels. And I hope that this introduction at least puts us on a little bit of the same plane as we move forward throughout the day. But before we do, I wanted to just really quickly thank a couple of people who have made this workshop feasible. First of all, Louisa Denier at the IUCN ELC has been the leader in organizing this workshop. You'll hear from her at the end of the day when she talks about taking the next steps forward. But she's been amazing. So yay, Louisa. Suzanne Laurel and everybody here at UMD has been very helpful in getting the workshop organized. Winnie at the IUCN Academy has also been extremely helpful in all of the organization. Our presenters, I wanted to give a shout out to, because for this particular workshop we required the submission of abstracts and the submission of draft papers, which meant they had to do a lot of work before coming here, and I really appreciate how everybody followed that model. I think it's made the papers, and as we'll see, the presentations much stronger as a result of your upfront work, so thank you. And thanks everybody else for attending. It's great to have you all here, and I know other people are planning to trickle in as they adjust to the time. So thanks, and then we'll move into our first panel. If we could have the panelists all come up, we'll have you sit up here, and Luis will be our first moderator.
Do you have a PowerPoint? Okay. Melissa, how does this work? Am I doing this?
I'll do this.
Who's guiding this?
I'll do this. I don't know. But I know how to do this.
All right. Someone has control, but...
Excuse me.
Here.
Is he doing it?
It's me.
Oh.
You want to...
Yeah. Which one?
The last one.
All righty. I should have done this before. Okay, there you go.
I think we managed.
She's
Control from here. Oh, yeah. Thank you. So, hi everyone. My name is Louisa Denier from the IUCN Environmental Law Center. It's a great pleasure to be here, and I have to say thank you to the Academy as well for this workshop, and yeah, it's been a real pleasure to organize. So, as you can see from the agenda, there'll be 9 speakers today, and we divided the day up into 4 different sessions. So, before lunch, we'll be talking about valuing ecosystem services and payments for ecosystem services, and then after lunch, we'll be talking about ecosystem services markets, and then 2 case studies on ecosystem services in Europe and in the United States. So, for the first panel, we'll have Blaise-Pascal, I'm sorry about your name, but difficult to pronounce, talking about the relationship of ecosystem services valuation with the Polluter-Pays Principle and the provider gets principle. And then we'll have again, difficult name, Froukje, Platjouw, from the University of Oslo, talking about the challenges to the realization of an ecosystems approach. And finally, Laurel Pentelow from Ottawa, talking about the connection between natural capital productivity and intergenerational equity. So you'll have 20 minutes each to talk, and then we'll have a 10 minutes question and answer session. So I'll be sitting there and shouting at you.
Sorry. Is here I can?
You just, I think you just click.
I click. Okay. Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. My name is Blaise-Pascal Ntirumenyerwa Mihigo. I'm a doctoral student of University of Ghent, and I'm doing Public International Law Department. And my research is on sustainable management of Congo Basin forest. Today, I'm pleased to talk to you about the relationship of ecosystem services valuation, protection, and distribution with the Polluter-Pays Principle and the Provider-Gets Principle. In this presentation, we are looking to know two main things, if there is relationships and how to make this relationship useful to have a sustainable management of ecosystem services. Before getting into details, I'm going to talk to you about the conceptual and legal frameworks of ecosystem services, the Polluter-Pays Principle and the Provider-Gets Principle. What's about the Polluter-Pays Principle? This principle was firstly introduced under the 1972 OECD recommendation. However, the best known definition of the Polluter-Pays Principle is provided by the 1992 Rio Declaration in its Principle 16. And the purpose of this principle consists of making the responsible of a polluting activity to bear the cost of pollution. Two main goals are followed by this principle. The first one is the sustainable use of environmental resources, and the second is the avoidance of distortion in international trade and investment. What's about the Provider-Gets Principle? This principle was discovered by two authors, Hanley, Brocklinger, and others like Hodge, and this principle is more applied in rural sector, agricultural farming. The principle proceeds by sustainable action in order to increase environmental quality. And the principle follows two main goals, the identification of ecological targets and the calculation of payments needed to achieve this target. There is a widespread mechanism called payment for ecosystem services, which is ruled by the Provider-Gets Principle. What about the legal framework of ecosystem services, the Polluter-Pays Principle and the Provider-Gets Principle? The first legal instrument which introduced the concept of ecosystem services is the Decision 5/6 on ecosystem approach. And 2 years later, this decision was reformulated under Decision 7/11 under CBD. The ecosystem approach is based on 12 principles, but two of them is very interesting for this research, is the Principle 4 and the Principle 5. The first one reflects the application of Polluter-Pays Principle. When we analyze the rationale of this Principle 4, we can see that this rationale supports the payment of environmental costs by who generates polluting activity. And there is the Principle 4, which is also interesting because they introduced first the concept of ecosystem services, and he highlights to the maintenance of ecosystem services as a priority target for the ecosystem approach. Another legal instrument which apply the Polluter-Pays Principle and the ecosystem services is the Plan of Implementation of Johannesburg, adopted under the Worldwide Summit on Sustainable Development and Environment. And what is important here is the recognition of the ecosystem the ecosystem approach, which was before adopted under the CBD. As well, this plan of implementation supports introduced the concept of ecosystem services under another terminology, which is services. We have also the strategic plan of CBD, which is very important here because it reflects the application of provider-gate principle. When we read the rationale of this strategic plan in the paragraph 10.d, we can see that parties are invited to ensure the continued provision of ecosystem services, which is the basic objective of the provider-gate principle. We have considered two main publication reports about ecosystem assessments, which are Millennium Ecosystem Assessment and the Economic of Ecosystem and Biodiversity. The first one not only contributes to the conceptualization of ecosystem services, but these reports analyze economic instruments which are used by the Polluter-Pays Principle and the Provider-Gate Principle. The second report, the Economics of Ecosystem and Biodiversity, proposed 5 solutions to better stewardship natural capital. And among these solutions, the recognition of the Polluter-Pays Principle for addressing biodiversity loss and pricing ecosystem services. The recognition also of payment for ecosystem services for rewarding benefit and adding value of protected area are recognized by these reports. As I said before, the payment for ecosystem services is led by the Provider-Gate Principle. Let me introduce the background of this presentation, relationship of ecosystem services, valuation, distribution, and protection with the Polluter-Pays Principle. First, I will start with the valuation of ecosystem services, the interaction between the valuation of ecosystem services with the Polluter-Pays Principle. Basically, the Polluter-Pays Principle proceeds by the conversion of a damaged environmental resources to an economic value. And this exercise makes practical the payment of environmental cost by the polluter. There is the decision 711 of the CBD in its implementation guideline of specifically the implementation guideline of the Principle 4, which reflects the application of the Polluter-Pays Principle, insists on the application of economic valuation methodology for ecosystem services. And there is methods like direct value, indirect, and intrinsic value, which is supported by this implementation guideline. Also, this decision insists on the incorporation of economic value of ecosystem services in important national sector. We have also Millennium Ecosystem Assessment to analyze taxes and tradable permits. For the first one, the reports insist on the inclusion of appropriated ecosystem services when we set up the tax, which is a one-off economic instrument used by the Polluter-Pays Principle. For the tradable permits, the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment stress on the incorporation, the well design of these instruments in order to reveal the price of ecological service, the price of ecosystem services. And the second report is also interesting, the economics of ecosystem and biodiversity. These reports support the association of Polluter-Pays Principle with the full recovery cost principle in order to full internalize environmental costs first and then to reflect the true price of ecosystem services. What about the distribution of ecosystem services with the Polluter-Pays Principle? We have to remember that the Polluter-Pays Principle is also a social principle because it tries to implement equity between polluter and non-polluter. The polluter should bear the cost and the non-polluter doesn't. And also when the tax of pollution is redistributed under public action, the polluter can gain benefit of this public action minus the environmental cost paid at the first stage, but the non-polluter entirely benefit from this public action, which is kind of distribution of ecosystem services benefits from taxes of pollution. There is the decision 7/11 insist on the equitable sharing of cost and benefits, which is one of the action, one of the incentive in order to implement the principle 4. As I said before, this principle 4, it reflects the application of Polluter-Pays Principle. We have also the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment, who highlight on the distributional implication of taxes. Taxes is also one of the economic instruments used by the Polluter-Pays Principle. The economics of ecosystem and biodiversity stress on the social impact of Polluter-Pays Principle when this principle is associated with the full recovery cost principle. And this could, the report support that this association of both principles can improve distributional implication of ecosystem services. What about the protection of ecosystem services with the Polluter-Pays Principle? We have to remember that one of the objectives of Polluter-Pays Principle is sustainable use of environmental resources. And there is action which is supports in order to sustainable use of environmental resources by the decision 7/11 of the CBD. This decision stress on this decision supports the application of environmental taxes and friendly behavior, environmental friendly behavior in order to promote the biodiversity conservation and sustainable use of ecosystem services. There is the report on Millennium Ecosystem Assessment stressed on the Pigovian tax, which is one of the first application of the Polluter-Pays Principle. This Pigovian tax was introduced by Arthur Pigot in 1920, and the report stressed on the role of the Polluter-Pays Principle in order to deliver selected ecosystem services. The economic of ecosystem and biodiversity, another report stressed on the states that the Polluter-Pays Principle, when associated with the full recovery cost principle, can address biodiversity conservation, biodiversity loss. What about the relationship of ecosystem services, distribution, valuation, distribution, and the provider gets principle? The provider gets principle proceed by the calculation of payments needed to achieve ecological targets. First, the principle has two objectives: the identification of ecological targets and the calculation of payments needed to achieve these targets. And the second side is very important, interact with the valuation of ecosystem services. We have the first report, Millennium Ecosystem Assessment, to talk about subsidies and direct provision of ecosystem services, which is instrument used by the provider gets principle. And for the first one, the subsidies, the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment supports the state that the application of subsidies can modify price of products which product can be associated with ecosystem services. We have also the second economic instrument, direct provision of ecosystem services, which for its implementation needs the determination of appropriate amount of ecosystem services. Is one of aspects of interaction between valuation and ecosystem services and the provider gets principle. We have also the economic of ecosystem and biodiversity, the second report, which supports the application of payment for ecosystem services. And some authors like Pagula and Hengel and Wunder talk about two modalities of payments, by cash and in-kind benefits. And in the process of these payments, the value of ecosystem services is also considered. What about the distribution of ecosystem services with the provider gets principle? This principle has essentially a distributive role. And the first distribution is between supplier and buyer. So the supplier, the provider of ecosystem services, the purely benefit of environment is from supplier of ecosystem services to the buyer of ecosystem services. And the second process of distribution is from the cost and the payment which from the buyer of ecosystem services to the provider of ecosystem services. The strategic plan also stress on this role of this distributional role of the provider gets principle and insist on the access by poor to benefit from ecosystem services. The Millennium Ecosystem Assessment in its side insists on prerequisites in order to implement the distributional implication of provider gets principle. Here, the report proposed strong policy and cohesion in community members which depend on ecosystem services. The second report, the economic of ecosystem and biodiversity, highlight also on the prerequisites in order to implement efficiently the distribution of payment for ecosystem services. As I said, is one of the application of provider gets principle. And these reports insist on property right, balanced power between local and non-local user, and a structured institution like of civil society system, legal and judicial system should be also well designed in order to make the distribution of payment for ecosystem services very efficient. What about the protection of ecosystem services with the provider gets principle? As I said before, the provider gets principles proceed by sustainable action, sustainable activity in order to increase the environmental quality. And the strategic plan who supports the provision of ecosystem services call country to maintain and to restore to action of biodiversity conservation and sustainable use in order to provide ecosystem services. And now we can say that after this analysis, we can say that there are relationship between ecosystem services valuation, protection, and distribution with both of principle, polluter pays and provider gets principle. And I made some suggestions in order to make them very efficient. And the first one is, I suggest a stable value of ecosystem services. How this suggestion could be implemented by first the integration of value of ecosystem services in economic instruments used by both principle, polluter pays and provider gets principle. I support also I think that this integration of the value of ecosystem services can help to comply the consumption and appropriation of ecosystem services. And then when we implement this stable value, we can have an idea how to control the loss or the increasing of ecosystem services. The second proposition is a controlled ecosystem distribution scheme. This could be possible as the report, the economic of ecosystem and biodiversity support by means of strong policy, penalty, and strong institution. And among those policy, property right and use of public ecosystem and distribution of benefit from ecosystem are among those areas which is important in order to strengthen policy and policy for a well distribution of ecosystem services. Okay, I finish. And the last proposition is a mixed goal for protecting ecosystem services. Here, I think that the Polluter-Pays Principle, when applied together with the provider gets principle, the first one can be an incentive to reduce, to discourage polluter and to reduce ecosystem services damage, and the other one, the provider gets principle, can incentivize the increasing of environmental quality. Thank you very much for attendance, and I'm glad to receive your question and suggestion. Thank you.
Hello. So any questions? No questions?
Yes.
Yes, please.
Thank you very much for your presentation.
Yeah.
The first suggestion about a stable value
Okay.
of ecosystem services, how do we achieve such a stable value?
Okay. At the beginning, I talk about the economic instruments, and I say to make this value stable. Okay. To implement this stable value, one way is the economic instrument, which is used by provider-gets principle as well as polluter-pays principle. And for me, in my opinion, I support that ecosystem services can normally in an ecosystem service management plane. We need, for example, the same price for the same ecosystem services, whatever is applied by the polluter-pays principle and the provider-gets principle. And then we can know how it's consumed and how we can also control the loss and the quantity of the ecosystem services. That's my proposition. So first, the integration by economic instruments, and then we set the same price, and then we can know how much is it, how much is not, and how to. This can improve the management of ecosystem services. That's the way I think. I don't know, maybe you can have a contribution about that. You can propose also. So.
Yeah, I totally agree with you, but that just I'm concerned, is it feasible? Is this what's happening in practice? Do they achieve a stable value each time they monetize the service?
No, I propose it because I find that it's not... it's just one of the suggestions, so it could be, we need further research about that, how to make it very implemented. So, yeah.
Thank you. Any other questions? Yes, please.
I'm just wondering about, this is a kind of a practical example, but if we were to take a forest and regard that as a source of ecosystem services, some of those services operate in a local context and some of them apply in an international or even global context.
Okay.
So the forest example is ecosystem services might be associated with controlling runoff, preserving water supply, and that, I think, is a local benefit derived from ecosystem services. But precisely the same forest also contributes ecosystem services in the form of carbon retention. The beneficiaries of the carbon retention are, I think, a different group from the beneficiaries of the runoff control. I'm interested to know how you envisage stabilizing values for ecosystem services in a context in which I believe the same ecosystem is delivering services to an expanding set of local, regional, and ultimately perhaps global markets, that is, beneficiaries of those services.
Thank you for your question. First of all, okay, it's very interesting question because I'm working also about, I'm working on forest. And what I said, okay, what you said, to summarize what you say is the difference between the nature of ecosystem services. And I mean, this also is very important in order to consider also the value, how to attach a value to different kind of ecosystem services. For watershed, for example, protection, it could be quite easy because the benefits and the delivery of watershed protection, it's in a local context. But for the global, like carbon sequestration, I mean, interveners should set a price. They have to agree about the price of carbon, for example, and everybody can apply them in a global context or national or, I mean, we need a big discussion in, like for example now about the rate plus mechanism. I mean, what could be interesting is to set a fixed price, and this price could be applied to, because the carbon sequestration benefit from a global level, this price should be applied, I mean, in my opinion, in a global community, global context. Everybody who has, like, for example, forests should apply this kind of price for carbon sequestration, for example. That is my opinion. I don't know if you agree or you have some suggestion about that.
I just saw the problem. I was hoping you would have the solution.
I don't have the solution also. Thank you very much for the question.
Okay, thank you. Any other questions? If not, we can maybe move on to the next presentation, which also addresses the questions that you just raised about how to evaluate the different values within one global ecosystem. So thank you very much for your presentation. Couldn't find the keyboard. That's why. I'll find it. It was hidden in the drawer. To put F5.
Yeah, that's fine. I think I stay into the time limit. Yes, first of all, thank you very much for all the organizers for initiating the workshop and putting together the program. I think my presentation kind of connects with his presentation, because I also am kind of concerned about the stable value of the ecosystem, but then I believe actually that the environmental law, the structure and the architecture of environmental law hinders achieving such a stable value. So the presentation is built up as follows. First I will spend some words on the concept of the ecosystem approach and ecosystem integrity. Then I will argue that the concept of integrity requires some kind of integration, and I will show that there are various dimensions of integration under the ecosystem approach. And then I will go into the role of law, and in short I will show that the structure and the design of environmental law may complicate achieving an ecosystem approach, mainly because of its high demand for value judgments on different parts of the same ecosystem. And then I will show that ecosystem valuation contains a degree of subjectivity, which makes it difficult to achieve such a consistent value. And I think that it's very difficult to achieve consistency in the determination of the value of an ecosystem, and that may conflict with the idea of an ecosystem approach and the idea of a holistic approach. And finally, some words on the road ahead. Firstly, the ecosystem approach. It's actually a concept which has by now been very widely endorsed in international law and European law. I forgot to introduce myself, I think. I'm from the European Union. I'm originally from the Netherlands, but now I live in Norway. So my research, I use a lot of examples from the European Union. So the ecosystem approach is also very much endorsed in EU law and also in national legal instruments. Throughout the definition, there is a core, there's a variation in the definitions. But the core of the ecosystem approach is a kind of governance approach, which is based on the ecological boundaries of the ecosystem, and then aiming at the balance between sustainable use and the conservation of the ecosystem. The maintenance of ecosystem integrity, it's often understood as maintaining the structure and functioning of the ecosystems so that a healthy level of production and provision of ecosystem service can be ensured. And it is to be ensured through holistic and integrated governance. Holistic means based on the ecological boundaries of an ecosystem, and integration means to integrate the different objectives like conservation and sustainable use. My slides are a bit longer than is proposed there. I don't know if something can be done about that. But
You mean for
the bottom line are not on the screen, but it's okay. I will now go into the concept of integration under the ecosystem approach. The concept of integration consists of 3 different dimensions, and that's also where the legal system comes in. The first dimension is the integration of conservation and sustainable use, and this integration is most obvious. It's reflected in the definitions on the ecosystem approach and also in the Malawi principles. This type of integration is, however, difficult. You may compare it with the challenge on the sustainable development to have both economic development and environmental protection. It has been recognized that one of the tools to facilitate this type of integration is through the participation of all kinds of stakeholders and decision makers and sectors. The importance of intersectoral cooperation has been emphasized regularly on discussions on the ecosystem approach. Intersectoral cooperation has turned out to be complicated. This is so because of the fact that the various sectors that are involved in the governance of the ecosystem, they have very different objectives, very different interests, and they comply with different legal instruments through the use of different tools and traditions. One important aspect that complicates intersectoral cooperation is the legal system. Today the legal system is very fragmented, whereby all the different elements of the ecosystem are regulated by different legal instruments, and this really complicates intersectoral cooperation. The 3 dimensions of integration, they are in a way interrelated, and a sort of integration in the legal system is required to facilitate the other dimensions of integration. A little bit more about the legal system. As I said, environmental law is very fragmented, whereby the different elements are regulated by different legal instruments. And this is apparent, this fragmentation, at the international level, at the EU level, and also at the national level. So you may find an amount of legal instruments that are, for instance, aimed to conserve particular species, particular habitats. You may also find an amount of environmental laws that aim to regulate activities within the ecosystem, such as fishery, oil and gas exploitation, shipping, building, etc. And you may find legal instruments that aim to regulate other activities with a more indirect effect on the ecosystem, such as pollution that comes from industry. So at the end, the ecosystem may become a place where various legal instruments apply, which have different objectives. In addition, these legal instruments they contain a degree of discretion. So common expressions that you may find within the instruments are that decisions need to be rational, they need to be effective, they need to contribute to sustainable development to the extent possible, if environmentally justifiable, etc. One good example is, for instance, from the Norwegian Nature Diversity Act, which is quite recent, from 2009, which says that the objective of that act is also to maintain ecosystem structure, functioning, and productivity to the extent that's considered to be reasonable. In addition, the principles of environmental law, they could actually serve to overcome the problems of fragmentation, provided that it would be understood consistently, they would be applied consistently by the various authorities. And that's, however, not the case. Most principles, like the integration principle, precautionary principle, Polluter-Pays Principle, and also the overarching principles of sustainable development, they have been understood quite broadly, and they do not aim to articulate exactly the outcome of a decision making. So they only provide kind of normative direction under which a variety of interpretations is still possible. So you may wonder what this has to do with economic valuation. But the problem is that discretion in environmental law requires value judgments to be carried out. And every time a decision has to be made, the administrative bodies have to weigh and value all the different values that are at stake. And often a cost-benefit analysis is applied to facilitate these kind of decisions. And I will now briefly go into the monetization of ecosystem services very briefly. But what I will try to explain is that there is a degree of subjectivity embedded within the process. And this, in combination with a fragmented approach, may result in inconsistent valuation of a particular ecosystem. And the fact that an ecosystem is ascribed a different value each time a decision is made may conflict with the idea of an ecosystem approach and with the ideology of it. So, the value of an ecosystem is estimated by summing up the value of the services that are provided by the ecosystem. So you have provisioning services, regulating services, cultural services, and of course supporting services. These ecosystem services they have different economic values. The total value of an ecosystem may be composed of use value and non-use value. Use value, for instance, refers to the value of an ecosystem. Services that are used by humans for production and consumption purposes. And these services can be used directly or indirectly now or in the future. And in this figure you see that there is a distinction between direct use value, indirect use value, and option value. In addition to use values, ecosystem services also provide non-use values. They are attached to the satisfaction that we derive from just knowing that the ecosystem exists. A good example is, of course, the polar bear, which has been mentioned often. And bequest value falls somewhere in the middle, as it refers to the satisfaction that people gain from the knowledge that the natural resource exists from the possible use for future generations. By now, quite a lot of valuation methods have been developed to express these values in monetary terms. The choice of what kind of method we use depends on the type of value, the ecosystem service, depends on the characteristics of the case, and on the data availability. I'm not going to describe these methods here, but what I want to make clear is that the point is that all of these valuation methods contain certain difficulties, technical difficulties, which make it difficult and which make them often a bit controversial, because the calculated value may be lower than its real value. And my main concern in my research is, in particular, that it may be difficult to reach consistency concerning the economic value of the ecosystem. The ecosystem may be ascribed a different value each time a cost-benefit analysis is performed. And this is the result of a number of subjective and arbitrary choices that are involved in the process of monetization. For instance, the choice of what kind of ecosystem services are to be monetized, the choice of valuation method, how do we handle technical difficulties. This may differ from person to person, how it deals with that. The choice of the discount rate, and the choice on the importance of a valuation exercise for a final decision. So there's a considerable degree of subjectivity involved in the process. And this, in combination with the fragmentation of environmental law and governance, these arbitrary value judgments, they are executed under different legal and political constraints and traditions on different parts of the same ecosystem. So how to ensure consistency concerning an ecosystem's value? As I said, there is a wide margin of appreciation within environmental law, and this combined with fragmentation, this may impede the realization of an ecosystem approach. So do we actually need such a wide margin of appreciation? This actually complicates a holistic approach due to the arbitrariness embedded in value judgments on parts of the same ecosystem. So I suggest that an ecosystem approach it requires environmental law to firstly harmonize the legal acts that apply to the same ecosystem, to codify the overarching objective of that legal system, such as the maintenance of ecosystem integrity, and then ensure that the principles and rules are interpreted and applied in accordance with this objective. And then I suggest to decrease dependency on arbitrary value judgments by creating consistent rules on the conditions for their use, how do we need to carry out these judgments, and what are the implications of a value judgment for the outcome of the final decision, because this is not always straightforward. The outcome of a cost-benefit analysis is not always binding in the sense that the decision-making authority has to follow the outcome. So, yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you very much for your presentation. Any questions again on this particular presentation? Yes, please, David.
Why is it important that there be absolute consistency in judgments? Or to put it differently, are you making the best the enemy of the good?
Yeah, that was.
I mean, in other words, why not live with just putting different valuations on in different systems? Because those are the systems that exist, instead of trying to reinvent something from scratch, which in practicality is impossible. And just come up with generic values and be willing to live with the fact that under one regime you're going to get one valuation, and under another regime you'll get another valuation, recognizing that it's better to get some valuation for ecosystem services than none.
Yeah, in some way, but I think that's the idea of an ecosystem approach, that you get some kind of holistic approach. And when you have different valuations, each time you make such a valuation, that's, in my head, that in a way contradicts a holistic idea, holistic approach. And I also believe that there is not so much we can do about that problem of inconsistent valuations, but I think we can do something about how the way environmental law is written. Particularly in Norway, it's very much discretion, extremely discretionary rules, where there's left so much freedom to the executor to make whatever decisions they want, and then whatever decision they want, it's not in violation of the law, because the law is so discretionary. So it's always in accordance with the law. So I think certain aspects of an ecosystem should be protected by law and not left to the discretion of a decision maker. For instance, ecosystem integrity, we should really, I think that could be protected much more stronger by the way law is written, just by certain prohibitions, say that this is allowed, this is not allowed. And at the moment, many issues are left to the decision making, unfortunately, and very little is really protected by environmental law. So I think there is not so much we can do about the valuation system, there is something we can do about the way environmental law is written. So, thank you.
Thank you. Any more questions? Yes, please.
I see among your proposition the harmonization of legal acts with when they are applied to ecosystem. How it could be possible, how in practice to harmonize those legal acts?
Consistency, you mean? Well, I think we can start very simple by having consistent formulations, consistent definitions. There are a lot of legal acts that use kind of terminology, different terminology, while they're actually referring to the same idea. Throughout the legal instruments you have, for instance, say that this need to be environmentally justifiable, environmentally defensible. Those kind of formulations could be made consistent in the first place. And then in the other, at second hand, we can do something about the way value judgments are performed. How do we value the ecosystem values concerned, or in accordance with the other values that are at stake, from social and economic value. How do we make that balance? Different legal acts have different balancing principles, different weighting and balancing mechanisms. And those kind of mechanisms could also be much more coordinated. And then finally, I think something can be done about being clear what the result of evaluation exercise, what kind of impact that has for the decision. It's not very clear whether it's legally binding or not. It's not at the moment, but if there could become some clarity about that, and having consistent rules throughout the legal framework, I think there is much more possible, much more coordination and coherence.
Could you just go back to the previous slide for a second?
This one?
Yes, because I was wondering also how, in your point 4, how in practice that could be done. Also, I mean, could you explain a bit what that would look like in practice with an example?
I think the first point, decreasing dependency, by that I mean having less discretionary rules and having more clearer prohibitions in environmental law. So in the first place, do we need a value judgment? I'm convinced that we do not need a value judgment for every aspect of the environment. Some aspects could be protected by law without leaving that to the decision maker. So that's the first point, of decreasing dependency on value judgments, having less value judgments. And then the second point, reducing arbitrariness of value judgment. I mean that creating rules of consistency, also what I explained here. First of all, how you write environmental law, having similar formulations, similar definitions, or for instance, having similar understandings of discretionary terms, like sustainable development on the one act should be understood similar, like sustainable development on another legal act.
But how would you deal with the subjectivity then of an interpretation? How could you agree on something which requires some...
I think it depends a bit on willingness.
Yeah.
Most of the executive sectors, they just want to have some freedom and to have the discretion to make the decisions they want. So there's not so much willingness to decrease discretion. So I think that's the goal of the lawyers, to try to achieve. Yeah.
Any other questions? Yes, please.
Yes, is it only an ecological ecosystem or a social ecosystem? Because we have a lot of problem to define what is an ecosystem. So thank you.
I think I'm most concerned with the ecological part, having a kind of governance system that's based on the ecological boundaries of an ecosystem. Because the legal system is very much splitting up the ecosystem in jurisdictional zones. So I'm really looking into the ecological ecosystem versus a legal approach. So yeah, thank you.
Okay. Yes, please.
Well, I want to thank you for the presentation, and I want to thank you for 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, about 8 words that you expressed in the middle of it that I think we could spend the entire week on. If I can quote you back to yourself, at about 9:48 this morning, you said the calculated value may be lower than the real value.
Less. less. I said less. Maybe lower than the real value.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So it seems to me that that phrasing just encompasses almost everything we're struggling with over the course of today and going forward. A calculated value comes from a process that we envisage as being, society envisage as being rational. The exercise of calculation may be right or wrong, but ordinarily, I think, from a legal perspective, if we envisage a process of calculation, we're talking about something that contributes to a number of our institutional and process values. It ought to be transparent, it ought to be accountable, it ought to be verifiable, it ought to be replicable, it ought to be subject to criticism and improvement, and all of those kinds of things that I think were implicit in David Hodis's earlier question about a relationship between doing as well as we can and striving for perfection. At the other end of the phrase, you actually do refer to the concept of the real value, as in, I think you're suggesting that there is a right answer. And I find that intriguing and challenging. Implicit in the way you conveyed the phrase that the calculated value may be lower than the real value is, I think, an assumption that those of us in the environmental community overwhelmingly make. That is, that our decision-making processes undervalue the environment and systematically get it wrong in one direction. Conceptually, philosophically, it must at least be possible for all of our calculations to be producing higher values than a so-called real value. So I just want to thank you for the presentation. You've pulled together all the stuff people are fighting about. And I think just created a forum that we could, this isn't so much a question as a comment, and thanks. Out of that phrase and out of trying to pull together where we are and how the processes of valuing ecosystems have to be integrated with the way the legal system works, you've really pulled a whole lot of things together in a wonderfully rich way. So thank you.
Thank you so much for your comment. I take it as a comment. I have to admit that I think the discussion between real values and calculated values gets so difficult and so controversial that it really gives me a feeling of justification for saying that environmental law should be stronger, and the role of environmental law could be much more strong and clear in this area by having less discretion. So thank you.
Hi, my name is Ben Richardson. Thank you for your presentation. Another dimension to incorporate into the evaluation is time. I mean, we're talking about values that we place today, but how are those values extrapolated over time, 50, 60, 100 years? Because at the same time, there are other kinds of economic investments that are being made that utilize ecosystems, and people who make those investments will adopt discount rates which will value something in the future that's not the same as today. So it seems to me that to have a consistent analytical framework for valuation, it's not just across spatial terms today, but across time. What's your thinking about that, please?
I think the choice for the discount rate is just one of the arbitrary choices we make in the process of monetization. So I just see it as an extra increasing the risk for inconsistency. I have problems with that because it really contradicts with the idea of kind of intergenerational equity and all those discussions. So yeah, I think it's just increasing consistency, and therefore we should have less value judgments. Yeah.
Okay, we'll have one last question and then we have to wrap up. Just
the issue of valuation and discount rates has got a lot of different implications. If you look at the conflicts over the value of, say, mining versus the value of, say, farming, when governments do the analysis, they come up with a discounted cash value of mining that's usually far greater than it is for the farming activity. My question is, would it be a significant improvement to have quite different approaches to valuation, and particularly to have a negative discount rate for environmental services that are going to become increasingly scarce?
Yeah, I think the aspect of negative discount rates is then at least you avoid the problems with intergenerational equity, that future generations have less value. So I think that might be a thing, but then the problem with having different discount rates for different activities, I think there's also an aspect of uncertainty and irreversibility, and you don't know what's going to happen. You don't know how we're going to affect the ecosystem by those activities in the long future. Did you want to say something?
The reason that I picked that question up is that you would never approve a mining project on that basis, which does come back to the earlier comment we made overvaluing services.
Okay.
To find a unified value is probably impossible. Worth pursuing, but probably impossible.
Yeah. I agree with you. Thank you.
okay, unless there are any other questions, we should move on to the next presentation. So, is that okay? Thank you very much.
Did you reject? Yeah. Thanks.
You know where it is?
Yeah.
It's up there. So good morning, everybody. It's great to see so many people here at this workshop on ecosystem services. We've had some great presentations, and I know we're going to have many more today. My presentation builds on many of the points that you guys have undertaken, and in fact, if you could come up with a consistent value, it would be very useful for the work I'm going to present to you, although I know that it's obviously a challenge. I'm going to present a bit of a different angle on ecosystem services and ecosystem service valuation, in that it's not the end point of my research. In fact, my research would use ecosystem service generally and the valuation to build to a broader goal. So you'll notice that the title of my presentation is The Connection Between Natural Capital Productivity and Intergenerational Equity, with a focus on ecosystem services. So the ecosystem services is inherent in what I'm going to talk about, but it's not, I suppose, direct in the title. My presentation today is based on some preliminary work from my doctoral dissertation, and if any of you are interested in this or have any questions and comments that we don't cover afterwards, I'd be very happy to speak with you. Before I go any further, I suppose I should introduce myself. My name is Laurel Pentelow. I'm a doctoral candidate at the University of Ottawa in Canada, and as I said, my presentation title is on the screen. Okay. So before we go any further, again, I want to clarify why you'll hear me speak about natural capital and not just ecosystem services. That's because the area that I'm working in, which is kind of a link between environmental ecosystem services areas, environmental economics, and environmental law, deals more in natural capital specifically and doesn't break down the different areas as much when dealing with larger concepts like what I'm talking about productivity-wise. That being said, I will talk about ecosystem services specifically and some of the other aspects here. Just so you're aware, when I say natural capital, I mean land, natural resources, including renewable and non-renewable resources, and ecosystem services, which is a key. So I also have a bit of a presentation outline here. So I'm going to talk a bit about my research rationale, which for the purpose of this paper and this workshop is looking at intergenerational equity and the link between natural capital productivity and inherent in that ecosystem services. And then I'm going to introduce some of the key concepts to kind of get us onto the same page, talk about productivity and talk about natural capital, and then talk about how they work together. And then talk about the way that economic valuation of ecosystem services links directly into that. As you'll see, the ideas that I have on natural capital productivity can't actually happen unless we have valuation of ecosystem services, because they're a key component to that. And then I will offer some conclusions. So we're going to talk a little bit about the rationale behind my research presented here today. It centers around intergenerational equity and achieving the goals associated with this principle. We know that the current rates of production today are degrading the environment. It's clear when we look at the many environmental issues that we're having: climate change, water scarcity in areas, smog, air pollution, and that sort of thing. And we also know that a degraded environment is a problem for intergenerational equity, because we wouldn't be able to pass along a world in at least as good of a shape as we inherited it from past generations. More specifically, though, I'd argue that a degraded environment and a degraded natural capital, and in that degraded ecosystem services, is a problem for future potential future economic productivity, because if current economic production is not only damaging our ability to pass along an environment to future generations that they can benefit through the use of the outdoors, through recreation and this sort of thing, but also it's damaging their ability and limiting their ability to have a certain level of economic activity and economic productivity. I'm going to talk about productivity for a little bit. When I say productivity, largely I'm talking about economic productivity. The previous speaker talked about ecosystem service productivity, which is also a type of productivity. When I refer to that, I'm going to call it natural productivity of ecosystems. So productivity in general in this presentation means economic productivity. So I think I've made several references to productivity in the last slide, and so I think it's important for me to give you a bit of a background on this economic measure for those of you who aren't familiar with it. If you are, that's great. This will be a kind of a debrief or a review for you. Productivity measures the relationship between the inputs in a production process and the outputs of economic activity. The general formula is up on the screen. There's a laser. Productivity equals output over input. This measure of productivity is extremely important when we look at an economy in the long term and look at economic growth in the long term. And it's particularly linked to standards of living. And that's why kind of over the long term, productivity is the key element to society's prosperity. And this indicates to us again why it's important for intergenerational equity, because if future generations don't have the capacity for an economy to be as productive as they want, they also may not be able to achieve their desired standards of living. I think maybe a little history on where productivity has come from will kind of benefit us as we move forward, and I propose adjusting this measure to include the values of ecosystem services, as well as natural capital, natural resources and land. But originally productivity was measured, and it still is a lot of times. If you hear the productivity of, it refers to labor productivity. That was the original measure, which is the output divided by the number of hours worked. It's a partial productivity measure, though. It doesn't include all of the different inputs. It simply measures the input of labor against total output. There has been some work that's been done that measures the input of a certain type of natural resources, perhaps water, into a production process versus the entirety of the output, which is interesting, but it really only measures the efficiency of that aspect of the ecosystem and that aspect of natural resources. So what I'm proposing moves beyond that, and it is kind of an expansion on this second, more recent productivity measure, which is multi-factor, which is basically output divided by all inputs, so labor, capital, energy, services, etc. Unfortunately, though, although they've moved to this point, when they define capital, it's simply capital that is market capital, so capital that has a market value placed on it. They don't go as far as to look at ecosystems that don't have market values on them. They don't look at the true value, again, as we were talking, of different parts of input. So if they are valuing the input of water into a production process, it may only be a very small value that's put on it and not the full value. Interestingly, there are other, you may have heard of discussions about the need to adjust GDP and other types of economic measures, and so this is simply an expansion on that. There's been less calls for research to work on the productivity measure than there have been for GDP, perhaps because it's a bit more complicated or for other reasons, but anyhow, this kind of falls in the same area as trying to introduce new measures of GDP and to make sure that the full values are introduced there. So I talked a bit about capital and the need for capital to be introduced as an input into this process. But before we can really get to natural capital and to a definition of natural capital, it's interesting to look at where the traditional definition of capital itself comes from. And so there are many definitions of capital. Some of them are on the screen here. So a stock of instruments existing in a time, a stream of services through time flowing from the stock of wealth, something that's reproducible by humankind. The question that we have to ask then is, does this definition work for natural capital? Can we simply say, okay, so the nature, ecosystem services, resources, it is another type of capital? The answer, as you may have expected, is both yes and no. Yes, we can say that natural capital is a stock of instruments existing at an instant in time. If you take a snapshot of an ecosystem and look at the resources and land and the ecosystems there, that is a stock. We can also say that it's a stream of services through time flowing from this stock of wealth. So we can look at ecosystem services, we can look at the goods and services from different types of natural resources, but we can't say that it's reproducible by humankind. Although there are maybe certain resources that renewable resources that can be expedited by human intervention, it's generally most natural capital can't be recreated. This is a huge stumbling block, and it has been, and it is why there are still economists and still people who struggle with the idea of natural capital. But there has been a more general definition that has worked better with the idea of natural capital, and that is any stock that yields a flow of valuable goods or services into the future. And so that allows us to then say, nature and natural resources, ecosystem services, and land all flow into there. So as I already noted, natural capital here is being defined as made up of natural resources, ecosystem services, and land. I know I'm like banging this to death, but I want you to make sure that you know I am talking about ecosystem services as well when I say natural capital. Together they make up natural capital, but they are also important to study independently. My focus in my research is on the first two, mostly on ecosystem services, but I do look at natural resources and their ability to be introduced into a productivity measure. So I'd like to try to illustrate for you the link that exists between current and future natural capital use within a production process and how this capital is used and should be included in productivity measures. I have a handout that I'll give you afterwards that have this diagram if you're interested in it. I just didn't hand it in beforehand. So if you look at this diagram, we see in the middle a box. I'm going to try to do it this way. So this, let's say this is like a factory that produces widgets. It's a typical use of a, and they're located on the St. Lawrence River. And we know that labor, capital, and energy are inputs into this process, and we know that those are valued in a traditional multi-factor productivity measure. And we know that the output that they produce, the saleable output, is a widget. We also know that there are all these other aspects that are inputs into the process. We've got water, which may be valued, may be included, but it probably won't have the full value of what we would use. And we see the ecosystem is right here. These non-saleable outputs are pollution, and they are going directly into the ecosystem often, and the ecosystem is providing assimilative services for pollution. They're providing air filtration, carbon sequestration from the plant, but none of that is included in a productivity measure. So essentially, the plant is using these ecosystem services, and they are not being required to pay for them, which comes back to the Polluter-Pays Principle, which you were talking about. And so if we are able to integrate and to somehow get the values into the productivity measure, it would require the companies to account for these things, and it would allow governments to be able to create policy and regulation that would help this system without it looking like it was automatically degrading productivity. And I will get there in a moment if you don't know what I'm talking about. So linking this into future natural capital use, if we don't include the non-saleable outputs and the non-market input and that full value of water, these areas are being taken advantage of and used wastefully, which means the things that we are doing today is impacting the ability for the future generations to use these. So they will probably have a diminished quality and perhaps quantity of natural resources for inputs into a production process, and natural capital and the natural productivity of the ecosystem will be degraded and will not therefore be available for future generations to use or use in the same form. So it will automatically drop the productivity of an industry that it perhaps operates throughout the years. So this slide is a bit of a recap. It's important, though, I think, as we move forward to look at, just to remember that current degradation of natural capital leads to a lower potential future productivity. It's also likely to mean a lower standard of living, which is at odds with the goal of intergenerational equity to allow them to have the same standard of living that we have today, or one in which they desire. So if those are the problems, and there are problems, what are the solutions? So typically, when we've been dealing with an environmental problem, some sort of environmental damage or pollution, we've been looking at environmental regulation as the go-to solution. But typically also, environmental regulation has been seen as something that automatically lowers productivity. Automatically, there's an extra cost associated with it, but there's no increase in saleable output. So if you think back to that diagram I had, there would be, the inputs would go up, so there would be more cost on the input side. On the output side, they would remain the same. So the saleable outputs would be the same, and so their productivity would go down, and that's a bad thing. Interestingly, though, there's been a bit of research on this more recently that's talked a bit about how these studies may not have looked at a long enough term, and so the productivity may start to actually come back up. So that's an area for future study, perhaps, but it's just an interesting point. Generally, though, the result is that industry often rallies against this environmental regulation because they feel that it will automatically decrease their bottom line. I would argue that environmental regulation only lowers productivity under a traditional and I think an incomplete productivity measure. So as I said, like GDP and other traditional economic measures, productivity does not include the values of the non-marketed natural capital, specifically ecosystem services. If it did, environmental regulation could be seen as boosting the productivity, because if you look on this slide, this is the traditional productivity measure, as I indicated before, but I've put more details. So saleable outputs, so those are the widgets, and market valued inputs, so those are the things like labor, energy, services. If we adjust the productivity measure to include and to require the use of ecosystem service values, we say productivity is saleable output, so that's still the widgets, but they're now required to account for the pollution and for the degradation of the ecosystem service that they use. And so that means that their saleable output value is, if you think of this as a positive economic value and this is a negative economic value, you can see that it would decline their overall output. And their market valued inputs the same as above with the non-market valued inputs. So the full values of, say, water or timber that they're using in a production process. So if you had, and this is, I know this is complicated and I have a much larger slide if anybody's interested, but I didn't want to get too detailed into it. But if you have, under the traditional productivity measure, if you had a piece of environmental regulation that came in and it said you have to install a scrubber on your, or a filter on your wastewater that is put out, then they would have the same amount of saleable outputs. They'd still produce 10 widgets, but their market valued inputs would go from 6 to 8 because they would have to pay more into the services or into the labor that goes into installing it. And so their productivity would go down. Under an adjusted measure, they would still have the same saleable outputs and they would still have the same increase in cost in the market valued inputs, but their pollution would go down. And so they would have an increase in that output area because they would have less of a negative value coming off. And you probably would see an increase in efficiency in the non-market valued inputs as well. So how do we use this formula, and how do we get from this formula to something that we can actually use in everyday work, or try to implement it? Obviously, we have to have values for these non-saleable outputs and for the non-marketed inputs. And here, the economic valuation of natural capital and ecosystem services is key. I'm going to talk really briefly about some of the challenges that have been talked about as well. One of them is the question of should we be even placing a monetary value on nature. There's always, obviously, the argument that nature has an intrinsic value, and therefore we shouldn't have to put a monetary value on it for it to be considered important. But as many of us know, no monetary value often means it's not considered by a decision maker, and in the case of trying to introduce a new productivity measure, it wouldn't be considered in this measure, and therefore it would be an externality and would therefore not be valued and would be degraded. It's an even bigger problem when we're looking to the future, because if we don't find a way to account for natural capital in our economic measures, like productivity, like GDP, the natural capital will be exploited and perhaps destroyed before it's even available for future generations to use, to enjoy, but also to use in their production processes and in furthering their economic activity. We know there are different uses of natural capital that need to be valued. It's not just one value, but a combination, like you were talking about. And we know that natural resources and land tend to be easier to value. Sometimes they have a market value on them, albeit perhaps not a full market value, but they will have stumpage fees, or there will be a cost for water. Yeah. Okay. This is a much less pretty version of the slide that the previous presenter had up there, so I'm not going to go through it as much, but I wanted to point out, like you had noted, that there is use and direct use. So use and non-use, and indirect use, and then I've broken it down in consumptive and non-consumptive use. If we're looking at trying to introduce these values into a productivity measure, the consumptive here, the harvesting resources perhaps, would be put into the input factor of the productivity calculation. The indirect use, the wetland filtration, the carbon sequestration, would be used when looking at the decline in value of the ecosystem as associated with that pollution, that non-saleable output. These are, again, ways to find the values of these different uses. So sometimes we have market values. The travel cost method works very well in hedonic pricing. Sometimes you can compare it to the cost of a substitute. You can look at the cost for cleanup, especially when we're looking at the idea of pollution being a non-saleable market or non-saleable output. And contingent valuation is obviously very popular. Contingent valuation, we were talking about overvaluation, and contingent valuation is sometimes said to overvalue resources because people are asked, it's essentially, for those of you who are not familiar with it, essentially people are asked, very basically, but how much would you pay to make sure that the polar bears exist for your great-grandchildren? And some people will say, I would pay $10,000. The question then becomes, do they actually have that $10,000? Would they actually pay that? Or is that simply what they think they value it at? And so that might be an overvaluation, and that's an area where there's a lot of challenge, because we're trying to somehow be able to figure out if that actually is a true value, or if that is something they've simply overstated out of an emotional response. So I think I'm basically out of time. But in conclusion, the implementation of a modified productivity calculation, which includes natural capital and ecosystem services, should allow governments to create policy and regulation that is aimed at improving our use of natural resources and ecosystem services. And it should be able to be looked at as not only a positive for environmental, in an environmental sense, but also an economic sense when everything is considered and properly valued. And these improvements will help achieve the goal of leaving the environment in a state that's no worse than it was received, and therefore allowing future generations to achieve the level of productivity and standard of living that they desire. the
Thanks a lot. Again, any questions from the audience? There's one over there.
I want to explore a little bit this relationship that you're mapping, the decline in natural productivity diminishes human prosperity and living standards. That's a statement that you're making, isn't it?
Yes, over time.
Yeah. Well, let's go back in history. I mean, if you look at human evolution over the last 10,000 years since the Holocene, there's an unmistakable characteristic, and that is the depletion of natural capital through agriculture, industrialisation, urbanisation. I mean, the fact that we're all meeting here in this room is a byproduct of substantial depletion of natural capital. But at the same time, this abundance of economic development has lifted billions out of poverty and created an environment that's very different. So if you take that historical perspective, the average person in the street would then look at your argument that depletion of natural capital diminishes living standards and say, well, the historical record doesn't show that. There's something else that has to be part of the analytical equation. What do you think of that historical record? How would you incorporate it into your thesis?
Well,
Please.
I think I would say that I think we're hitting or have hit or almost hit a tipping point where we have got to the point where we have used up all the different available, easily available substitutes. So we may have only used part of the freshwater system or part of that, and we've decided that, well, we can build water filtration facilities for certain areas of the world, and we can continue to develop while using those. But at some point, and when we hit certain areas and certain things, there are no substitutes, or they're very, very expensive substitutes to be able to continually develop and prosper in this way. And we're hitting critical massive environmental issues. We're hitting the climate change, we're hitting loss of water, and the population on Earth and the continual drive for this economic prosperity is something that at some point we are overtaking the capacity of the natural world, of natural capital, to kind of reintegrate itself and to continually use itself. So I think you're right. I think that in some senses the historical perspective does not lend credence to my argument, but I think that we've hit, and it's a point, and I think many people would agree that although we've been able to use natural capital and to kind of use it in the most efficient way, at some point we've hit a point where we have developed too much, there are too many people, we're using too much, and we're not allowing the natural system to kind of restore itself and restore itself so that it can continually be used.
Yeah, so thank you. So it may be that the work of someone like Herman Daly and the problem of scale would add that additional perspective to your work, the idea that there can be significant consumption of natural resources, but it's within a certain scale. I mean, the market itself has no intrinsic capacity to scale consumption within the biosphere limits.
Yeah.
But I suggest as we move forward, we have to have a model that simply doesn't say more consumption means a greater depletion of resources.
Definitely.
And there are other elements. Thank you very much.
Thanks.
Thank you. So there's one question by Melissa and then David. So first David, yeah, go ahead.
Thank you very much for your presentation. All three were really very, very good and really covered a wide range of issues. I'd like to follow up on Ben's comment because I wrote down when you said current degradation leads to lower productivity. I wrote down, what about innovation and technology jump shifts, which where we, as the resources become more dear, the price goes up, and then we develop some new way of doing it where the old resource is not even used anymore.
Yeah.
And I guess as a devil's advocate, I'd also sort of raise the point that Mark Sagoff has raised as an environmental philosopher, that he argues that every generation is satisfied with the environment they grew up in, because that's what they're familiar with and that's what they have bonded to.
Right. To your first point on innovation and technology, you're right, and that tends to be the fallback when you talk about productivity. Oh, well, we've always innovated, we've always created more technology, and that's why won't we continue to? I think you're right at some level and to some point, but there are certain parts of the ecosystem that create, like innovating and creating a human-made way of doing the same thing is just either it's going to be astronomical in price, and it's hard to believe we could get to a point where that value would be okay, or it's not even possible. I think about water as fresh water, and obviously you can use desalination, and we can desalinize the ocean water for drinking water and for processes that require that, but it's pretty hard for us to create a brand new freshwater ecosystem that does all of the same things that Lake Huron does, or that something like that. So to some extent, you're right about technology, and things like desalination is a good example, but I think that when it comes to ecosystem services, it's very, very, very difficult to believe that we can do that. To the point about every generation is happy with what they get, that may be, but I think, in my opinion anyways, the idea of intergenerational equity really, that's not for us to decide. And so we want to be able to pass along to them as best as we can, or at very least what we had, so that they can make that decision for themselves. And that's what I'm trying to get at. We don't want to pass along the ability for them to only be half as productive as we have been in our society. They may choose to be like that anyways. They may choose, we're going to, our standard of living, it doesn't need to be as high. We're just as happy with a lower standard of living, the way we define it. And we don't need to have the productivity that, the past generations have had, but to have that ability to make that choice is what I'm trying to get at. We want to be able to pass that along, so that we don't cap their ability because of the use that we've made and because of the inefficiencies that we've had. Yeah.
Thanks. Melissa, you had a question? Very quickly, maybe a bit.
It's a long question.
It's a long question? Okay, yeah, we're 4 minutes over time, so...
Yeah, I'll wait.
Okay. So thank you very much. We have half an hour break, and so we'll meet here again at 11 in this room.